Hi, my name is Dr. Ray Pastor, and today I'm going to talk about 3D learning, the concept of 3D learning and what that means. So 3D learning is a concept, a theory that expands on prior cognitive theories, and the theories that focused on these two channels, text and images. A 3D learning attempts to explain how we learn content in the real world through all domains like psychomotor, affective, cognitive, how we learn from games, how we learn from virtual reality, how we learn from, learning while we're doing these hands-on projects that we do. It's an organic, living, and changing theory that's going to constantly need to be revised and updated as research happens because, research has really only begun to scratch the surface of it. So how do we construct knowledge? So first of all, we have all these models that, this is kind of the back end of where I came up with this idea of 3D learning really comes from. So we start with Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968, their information processing model, where we have this sensory idea where we get, sensory information. That's like our attention. It goes in the short term or working memory where we work with some, items to put it in the long-term memory. That's our basic information processing model that we have. That's a very famous, starting point for a lot of the research in this area. And then we have the famous, what is working memory or learning memory? And we have Miller's, famous 1956 idea that learners can hold 7 concepts or 7 items and they're work with 7 items in their working memory at one time, plus or minus 2, depending on how meaningful they are to them. So I just want to bring up that point of working memory and kind of what it is that we have this limited capacity in there to kind of do, pull things from long-term memory back and forth to kind of work with them. All right, so how do we process and how do we learn? How do we process in this working memory and how do we learn? And that leads us to Baddeley and Hitch. They have their 1974 working memory model, very famous, kind of the backbone for a lot of the newer theories out there. And basically they came up with these, 2 almost channels and a central executive where, we had the kind of the verbal and visual sketch pads, the phonological loop, and that's kind of how we processed information through these 2 areas. And Baddeley had revised that in 2000 with his episodic buffer. But that's the start. So this is kind of the background of where this came from. That led into Pavio's theory, which is dual coding theory. Dual coding theory, kind of was an extension on Baddeley's, idea that we really have these 2 channels, verbal and nonverbal. And they're able to work together or work independently of one another in working memory to put things in long-term memory. And that leads us to today and really what we have and where we are. And, where we are is really an extension of those theories, which is the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. This is a theory developed by Mayer and colleagues, people like with cognitive load theory, Sweller's cognitive load theory, and a few others have contributed to this. But basically, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning expands on these prior theories and basically said that working memory is made up of this dual modality, dual coding, input channel system, that there is a limited capacity in working memory, okay, and that learners engage in active processing to, work in working memory and pull things to and from long-term memory as they remember things. And Mayer's written a few books, done a number of research studies on this. And you can see on the screen, for those of you just listening via podcast, you won't be able to see, but I'll describe it. But basically you can see, he has his, we get things from our ears and eyes, how they're processed into these 2 channels in the sounds and images in our mind, this verbal and pictorial model, and how we integrate that with prior knowledge to store things in our long-term memory. All right. So that's kind of where we are. This is where we have this multimedia research. We have these multimedia principles stemmed from this theory, which is really how we're designing for games. We're trying to describe well, how do people learn through games? How do people learn through multimedia, through video? And we came up with these theories. And then they lived happily ever after. That's it, right? That's it. We don't need to go any further. But there are some issues. There are some problems. There are some what ifs. There's a lot of things out in the field even that are questionable, that people are saying, well, but what about this? But wait, this doesn't fit. For example, We have this idea of learning styles, which we know learning styles are a myth. All the research shows they don't exist, or we can't really define even what they are, let alone try to research them. And when we do studies, we find someone's learning style didn't make a difference in the outcome of the study. But we still have this idea ingrained in us. Why? Why do we have, and like I have written here, multiple intelligences as well. Why do we have these ideas ingrained in our mind? You know, I can tell teachers that learning styles don't really exist, that we don't have the research to back them up, that the research shows that they don't exist. And they have all these examples. They say, but I know a kid and he prefers to learn this way, or he learns this way. Or no, that doesn't, because the concept of learning styles in some ways makes sense to us. So what our previous theories haven't done is they just haven't explained that. And then we have these learning preferences, and learning preferences are like, you know, I prefer to learn via games, or I prefer to learn via video, you know, and obviously there's a level of motivation that makes a big impact in how people learn. But assuming motivation's equal, like in the workplace or in school when you should be just trying for good grades, where you want to get paid, you don't want to get fired, that's your motivation. Learning preferences don't make a difference. I can prefer to learn through video, but when I am taught via lecture and PowerPoint and all that stuff, I'm going to learn probably just as well. There's not going to be a difference in achievement. So your preference for learning doesn't necessarily make much of a difference. Okay, so I've gotten that out of the way. That's kind of the background of this. So, and then I started asking myself these questions. I've been asking myself these questions, especially when I start talking about the learning style thing and other things in education that, you know, people are just questioning, and what they're asking they're not asking bad questions. They're asking really good questions, but our explanations aren't necessarily always explaining them. You know, so I asked myself, looking at these theories, how do these account for real hands-on learning? You know, how do these account for playing a video game or doing any kind of task, really? Like, what about in virtual reality? You know, places we use other kinds of learning besides what's happening in our mind. And that's when we start to get to these domains of learning, like psychomotor and affective, as Bloom has defined them. And, you know, what I've come up with based on what the literature shows us and what makes sense is that these psychomotor and affective tasks require cognitive resources. You know, they're using working memory. So even though we might separate them, you know, in Bloom's taxonomy, and we have just so we have different instructional strategies to, you know, for affective tasks, or different instructional strategy or a model for psychomotor tasks, which is great. You know, when we're talking about what's happening in our mind, in our working memory, when we're trying to learn things, we're using those. So let's get to that in a second. So I started doing some digging. Lo and behold, you know, the person who basically came up with the whole theory, you know, one of the major contributors to this of working memory and how people learn badly, in 2012 has asked during one of his research papers, this is a quote, can other modalities, such as smell and taste, be added to working memory, you know, without impacting visual or verbal capacity? Are there separate subsystems for smell and taste? I found this and I said, wow, so wait a second, smell. I never really thought about smell, but do we learn via smell? Oh, well, sure, a cook does. And there's various reasons why we do. A doctor, like, what does it smell like? Well, you know, there's certain reasons why we do. And I thought this, we have these verbal and visual channels. Well, do we have a channel for smell? So I started to do more, you know, and seeing that from Badley is a pretty big deal, right? He's one of the major contributors in this. You know, so I take what he says a little more seriously. You know, he knows what he's talking about. He has the background knowledge to, you know, talk about this. So then I found another, and I found more, but I'm just showing a few examples here. You know, an article from Quake. And basically, this is a 2015. And he says that we tend to look at the way we process information in a stationary fashion. That's where I came up with a 2D. We examine these 1 to 2 channels at a time, which are always text and images, or like narration and images, you know, animation and narration. Whereas in real life, that's not really how we necessarily learn in real, you know, workplaces and stuff. You know, we might be feeling things, we might be hearing things, there might be sight, taste, you know, different urges like hot, cold, feelings involved. And so I started to think, why do we look at these things in this 2D fashion? You know, what's going on? Why is that happening? And what are we missing from this? You know, so I started to look at the way we work. I started to look at how we play games, use our senses. I mean, I have a picture on the screen here of a kid playing, or a person playing a video game. And you can see on the controller, you're using your hands, your buttons, that tactile, kinesthetic, that haptic. You know, you're using those psychomotor skills to play a game. So I start to think about all these other, you know, starting with our senses. Like I said, well, what are our 5 senses? And I came to realize after looking at the research, we have a lot more senses than 5. Like hunger and thirst are senses, not just vision, hearing, feeling, you know, the smelling, the things that we were taught in as a kid that, you know, these are our senses. I'm not a biologist, so that's not my area of expertise. So I didn't even really think about that we had these more senses. But we need to start looking at these fields because they know that kind of stuff. So I started to look at, wow, we have all these senses, and I wonder how we process them. So I started to ask myself, was there research out there showing that we even process this stuff in working memory and that it's its own channel or anything like that? And just like that, I realized we have researched some of these modalities. It's scattered and it's rare. There is not a lot of it, but it's out there. We've done some of this research. We started to look at these things. For instance, Johnson in 2011 states, and this is a quote, his study was examining the olfactory system operates in working memory, that it has received almost no attention in the literature, 2011. So you think about that, and why is that? Why hasn't it received any attention? But the bigger question is that, you know, we have studies showing that it might be that there's something there. So Andre D. and Donaldson in 2007 conducted a series of experiments that found that there was a modality-specific space in working memory for a learner's olfactory system. And Johnson's study in 2011 confirmed that. And there's several other studies out there confirming the same thing. So then I said, okay, well, that's olfactory. What about like haptic? Or what about these other senses? Lo and behold, I started to find stuff out there too. There's research scattered throughout the databases that shows that these other modalities, these senses, have a space in working memory. You know, so Lurch, Sui, and al. in 2016 conducted an experiment which found that haptic information can be stored in working memory and has its own channel as well. Seaborn, Reich, and Antle in 2010 conducted a study that found similar results, and there's more and more of this research out there. I couldn't believe that I was starting to find these studies, and it wasn't difficult to find them. I mean, I was doing some digging, but not that much to really start to come up and say, wow, okay, we have something here. There are separate channels. We have research showing that there are separate channels. What can we do with this? What can I do with this? And I started to really analyze and look at all these theories and start to put together a new concept. So what I started to realize is we've been focusing, and I have a picture here of just the United States on the screen. We've been focusing on the United States when we have the world. We haven't been focusing on the world. We've been focusing on one small piece. Now, that small piece is super important because it led us to where we're going to go in the future. And it's the basic building block. It's not incorrect. It's right. It's a building block to the next thing. So I'm not looking at these other theories and saying these aren't correct, that what they were saying was wrong. No. They're exactly right. There's extensions to them. So what I'm trying to do, what this 3D learning is I'm going to get to it. It's an extension of all these other theories. It's the next logical step. It adds to them. So I came up with this model for 3D learning, and it's very simple. Okay, so let me start, and for those of you listening, you're not going to be able to see it, but I will explain it. So let me start on the left-hand side of the screen with what I said in the beginning of this presentation. And basically that was 3D learning is a theory that expands on prior cognitive theories, 2D cognitive theories like dual coding, cognitive theory of multimedia learning, the theories that focused on these two channels. It attempts to explain how we process content in learning in the real world through all these domains, from games, experiences, virtual reality, hands-on. It's organic, living, it's changing. Research has only begun to scratch the surface. So then I have my model. The model is super simple. It doesn't need to be complicated. It's more the explanation that becomes complicated. But my goal is to make this as simple as possible. And the reasons for that is because, we're still talking about learning styles. We can't get rid of it. We need to keep things simple and explain them to people. So 3D learning starts with multiple input sources. There's multiple ways that we can receive information. It can be a feeling, like someone can scratch me. Our brain gets information through multiple sources, whether I'm seeing it, smelling it, tasting it. Okay, they go into my sensory memory, right? Atkinson and Schifrin, right? This is their basic model. Goes into our sensory memory. In that sensory memory, we experience it and we decide if it's going to go into our working memory or it's just like a nothing, like dismissed right away. This is a quick thing that happens, right? If we're learning something, we're going to try to put it in our working memory and do something with it, right? Okay, so then we get to our working memory. Again, Atkinson and Schifrin and all these other our working memory, we know what it's doing, right? Okay, so in our working memory, learners can process information through a number of channels, not just visual and verbal. There are other channels. There's haptic, kinesthetic, olfactory, taste, and many more. We don't know all the channels that we have. The idea is that there are more than two. It keeps expanding. All right, next part of 3D learning. Learners can process multiple channels at the same time, can work together or independently from one another. Now, we don't know. We do know this is the case with verbal and visual, right? We have some research showing that like olfactory can be processed in addition to visual, that haptic can be processed in addition to visual. But there are all these other channels out there. So can they all work independently? They can all work independently, but can they work independently of each other? We don't know that yet. This is what the research needs to start to find out. So this is future stuff. And I have future on the next screen, but I'm talking about it. So, we don't know all the combinations yet of what works well together and what doesn't. But we know they all have their own channel. We do know that. At least that's the theory. All right. No matter how many channels we have, we can I've seen some of the research saying we have like 20-some senses and stuff. Different ways to experience things, So no matter how many we have, working memory is still our limitation. That we can only store a number of things in working memory and work with it at one time. And, we're pulling things from our long-term memory back and forth, our prior knowledge from our long-term memory. But we're still going to be always limited by working memory. And that gets to, well, can we process 4 different channels at one time? What are the effects of that on cognitive load? Because we know, cognitive load, there's the redundancy principle. Like if we tried to do visuals, text, and narration, we can overload our mind. We know that from the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. But what if we did vision, images, hearing, and smell? Does that overload our working memory? We don't know that. But we know working memory is a limitation. Training can improve each channel. Training can improve each channel. This is something that's, pretty, should be pretty self-explanatory. But, we talk about reading. Take the example of reading. I couldn't just read. I spent years and years. My son, when he was 4, started to learn basic letters. When he was 5, started to learn basic words and sentences. Now my 2nd grader is reading small chapter books. We've spent years being taught how to read better, how to understand what we're reading. So of course, when I'm learning something via reading as an adult, I should do an excellent job at it. But guess what? How much of your years were spent learning how to smell and learn from smells? Now, we smell things as humans all the time. But have you learned to learn through your nose? Have you learned, when you sit down and the first time you go to play the guitar or play a video game, you don't have any coordination. You don't have it. It's a skill. Those are things you have to work on. These channels can all be improved. That leads to my next point. Learners will have natural strengths and preferences for one channel versus another. This is where we start to get into that well, I'm this kind of learner and I like this and I'm hands-on and I like doing this. Yeah, you have preferences. We do have preferences. That's not to say they're better, but we have preferences. So first of all, we have natural strengths. No different than you take 10 kids, put them out in the soccer field with no practice and tell them to play. Guess what? One or two kids are going to stand out as being faster or have a little more ball control just because they're naturally better at that. Same thing with like math or reading. There are a few kids that kind of stand out. They have this natural ability to do some of that stuff. This is no different than learning. Some people are going to have like excellent like skills to be able to hear better or to be able to smell or have better hand-eye coordination to play a video game. Their channels, certain channels will be stronger on certain individuals. And then that can make them have a preference towards that, or they can just, there's motivation there that certain channels will motivate people more. There will be different levels of motivation for each channel. They're going to have a preference. All right. Learners can work with prior knowledge from long-term memory, obviously, just like Atkinson and Schifrin's model or cognitive theory of multimedia learning. You're pulling from this long-term memory, you know, to expand on your ideas. This processing. And long-term memory is said to be indefinite. We have no evidence that it's not, you know, as of now, we know we can store things there and definitely recall them as we need to. And that is the basic concept of 3D learning. It's really the idea of expanding our, you know, if we want to look at all these other models, 3D learning is just saying, yep, we can add more channels to all of these. And there's some more to it. You know, I added like we can improve the channels and some stuff like that. But the basic concept is we have more modalities. We have more than 2 channels. We have more. And we can't just say, well, you know, if they're doing something on a remote, that's psychomotor, it doesn't apply. This is a cognitive model. It does not work like that. Because in real life, in real training, some objectives are going to combine those two together. And we have evidence that while you're doing that thing, it's in our working memory at the same time. We cannot separate them there like that. We can separate them for instructional strategy purposes, but not there. All right, so what's next? First, we need to expand on the multimedia principles to start to incorporate these other modalities and test them. We need to start, there's a full body of research for people to start testing. We probably should be calling them something like the principles of learning or something, because the multimedia principles really refers to specifically multimedia, but I can add gaming as gaming multimedia, maybe, but now that we're, you know, the definition of Mayer's multimedia is verbal and nonverbal, like narration and vision, not like doing on a remote control. Not being in virtual reality environment and having a smell come in. It doesn't include that, so maybe we need to call it something else. But we need to expand on them because those are super important. Right there, the multimedia principles is our like, here's how this actually works. Here's our building block. That's the first, you know, as I said, we were focusing on the United States. Let's expand it to the world. Let's just make it bigger. We've already done some of the nuts and bolts, like all that initial research on all the multimedia stuff is awesome. Like those are our initial, like, this is how it's applicable. Let's just apply it to some new things. What are these other channels? Like we have basic like olfactory. So we know we have smell. We know we have this kinesthetic, like tactile, haptic. We know we have taste, but what else? What else is going to be impacted in learning, and what can we test? And how do we test it? What combinations work best? So like, you know, and how many is too many? Like, can you combine 3 or 4 or 5 channels and that doesn't overload working memory? And maybe like, can you combine like olfactory and taste together, or that doesn't work? Or can you combine like olfactory, vision and hearing together, and does that, or what about vision and just olfactory, and what are the combinations and how many is too many? That's where we need to expand on the multimedia principles, and that's where this theory, these 3D learning ideas come into place. And this is especially crucial to like the gaming literature and VR, as VR becomes more and more common. You know, VR is going to be more common in like military and medical, like simulations. We get into these advanced simulations because the doctors are they're trying to hear stuff, they're trying to see stuff, they're paying attention to 10 different things. So let's come up with, you know, we can't just apply like this visual and verbal thing because there's a lot more stuff happening. So let's start applying those principles and figure out what are the principles to guide them. That's it. Thank you.